thank you for being here. Just as an important part of the beginning of this session, I just want to mention that I'm joining today virtually from the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And it's really important that we take time to acknowledge, in terms of the connection to the land and the climate justice movement, our Indigenous communities are the original stewards of this land and this climate movement. So just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that, and we'd love to hear from you, to drop in the chat where you're joining us from today, so please feel free to do that. My name is CJ Tremblay. I'm the Vice President of the board for CANIE, and I am based in Vancouver, Canada. It has been a bit of a wild last few months in the Northern Hemisphere. There were some really wild fires this summer, some heat waves like the Pacific Northwest has never seen, some disastrous flooding in Europe where many of our colleagues are. And we aren't far removed really in terms of the wildfires in Australia. And all of the above were deadly, and all of these were also exacerbated by climate change. On top of that, there's an announcement, recently by way of a new report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was released, highlighting that there's a code red for humanity. So putting all of those things together, it was a tough time for a lot of people, mentally and emotionally, even though we knew all these things to be true. So, there's a lot of work to be done. We're grateful that you're taking the action of being here today and of spending your time with us, whether it's live and you're in this Zoom room with us, or it is the future and you're watching this on YouTube. We're just really grateful that you're taking the time and making this choice to be here. So I want to tell you a little wee bit about CANIE. If you're joining or watching, you likely know a little bit about us already. We were founded in late 2019 with our first ever CANIE Summit in May 2020. We are a volunteer-run organization with a global board, members in Australia and Europe and the Americas. And recently, bolded there is very exciting, is our growth in regional chapters, where we've got chapters in Europe, Oceania, and Americas. And we are looking to continue to grow and expand. So if you are in one of these regions and you would like to join, please, by all means, we do want to hear from you because we are continuously looking to grow and expand. And we have these global working groups as well. So a lot of CANIE volunteers will work on working groups like marketing, fundraising, climate justice, the podcast, and we're supporting practitioners from 750 plus institutions to date, as well as different organizations helping in the sector. And you can have a look at our vision and mission, and we're constantly really just striving to push the sector forward. And we're now in the context of, COP26. The world is watching because all of the nations of the world come together in Glasgow to address the climate emergency. And it's against this backdrop that we're here today to rally, rise, and meet this moment, the moment that our students are really clamoring for us to take action. There's a full slate of events. There's 11 events taking place this week. We had 2 incredible climate justice sessions earlier yesterday and the day before, depending on when you're joining us. And we had the 2 Leaders Forum, and now we're in the first of 2 summits. So as many people as possible have the opportunity to join because we're doing these sessions live twice so that people can engage with each other and connect to move us all forward. We're also going to be having regional meetings over the course of the week. So we do encourage you to go to the CANIE website, and register for your regional meeting. And fret not if there is no regional meeting for you. There is a meeting that is global, where we are encouraging people, if you're not in one of those regions but would like to be involved, to join the global meeting. Now, that brings us to today. And what we're looking to achieve today is make space to learn about climate anxiety among practitioners, want to get some practical, actionable steps to start making changes, and we want you to meet like-minded practitioners and share key takeaways. Now, these objectives are derived from what we've heard from you over the last year and a half after our first summit and a number of events since then. We heard you that you wanted to start taking action right away and you're looking for sort of quick start tips. We got you. And we also heard that you want some time as part of our events, not separate or on a later day, but you want to be able to process and discuss and network and meet with people to talk about the things that you just learned about. So today we are going to be having a networking and just kind of session to talk about what we've sort of gone through. We're really excited today that we've got an hour and a half. We've got 2 hours with half an hour of networking at the end. So we've got an hour and a half program with a 30-minute networking session for the first time, which is very exciting. So a couple of housekeeping notes. You might have noticed that this is a meeting format and not a webinar format. So we would love cameras on if you're willing and mics off if it's not too much trouble. We also encourage you to ask questions and post in the chat. It's really, we've got really quite the program for you today. And I really just want to keep us to time. So I'm going to get us going on the first session. If you joined us at our first summit in May 2020, you will recognize these two faces. And they have a new face with them. So Anne Campbell and Thi Nguyen presented about international student climate anxiety. And if you joined us then, that chat was exploding. It was, we were seeing Anne and T like blow people's minds in real time was amazing. And it is something that has stayed with people. We've had a lot of feedback on it over the course of the year. And so part of that discussion, Anne and T said, we hope to do more. And sure enough, they did. And they have delivered with some additional qualitative research. And they are joined this year by Maya Stewart on their team. And I'm going to throw to the presentation that they recorded for us. It's a brief presentation, about 15 minutes, but then Anne and Maya are here and we'll have a discussion. And then any questions that come up, please do feel free to pop them in the chat. We're going to keep an eye out and make sure that we address as many questions as possible.
Hello, my name is Dr. Anne Campbell, and I'm speaking on behalf of our team, which includes Thi Nguyen and Maya Stewart. And we're here from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California, to talk with you about our presentation titled Going Global versus Going Green, Practitioners, Perceptions, and Concerns. This is based on a research project that we started in 2020 to respond to the growing concern from students, alumni, staff, and faculty about the role that international education plays in climate change. Increasingly, we were worried about the business as usual approach to international mobility for education purposes. And we understand that international travel by plane contributes a great deal of carbon to the atmosphere. Yet at the same time, we truly value the transformational experience of international education that each of us has benefited from. And we are committed to expanding this transformational education more broadly to diverse populations and generations of future students worldwide. So we felt stuck, wanting to promote international mobility while decreasing carbon emissions. At the same time, climate change At the same time, climate change became a topic in many of our classes and in my office hours. Students were asking me how I was personally responding to these topics. So thanks to the Middlebury Institute, we were able to receive funding to support this research and take it further. And last year, T and I designed a qualitative research study to better understand the ways that international education professionals respond to climate change. We were interested in their opinions, feelings, and actions, both those they take professionally and those that they take personally. We also wanted to know about their aspirations for the future of the field. We put out a call for interviewees and spoke with 17 individuals who are either early career or mid-career international education professionals. Maya Stewart joined our team this year, and all three of us are here to present today. Individuals in this study participated in interviews ranging from 60 to 90 minutes during the summer and fall of 2020. And we're very grateful to our interviewees to speak with us during one global crisis, which was the COVID-19 pandemic, about another, which is the crisis of climate change. This exploratory qualitative study was designed to answer two research questions, which are here on the screen. First, how do international education professionals perceive the relationship between international student mobility and global warming? And then second, what additional information do international education professionals need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? For today's talk, we will focus on certain findings from the study that are relevant to the theme of this CANIE Summit. That is climate anxiety among professionals and climate action. Maya and T will each present one set of findings. And then after this, we're each going to share a takeaway message from our work together. Like you, we have been thinking deeply about the intersection of international education and climate change. And this has raised some important issues, questions, and recommendations for a way forward. And we'd like to share those with you today. And now I'll turn it over to Maya.
Thanks, Anne. So from our research, we found that the majority of practitioners in the study reported some level of climate anxiety. Before we proceed, we want to define climate anxiety. It is a chronic emotional distress induced by global warming related events that stems from the growing awareness of direct and indirect environmental impacts on individual lives. These definitions have been shaped by many scholars, but we would like to acknowledge Blanche Verley at the University of Sydney and Sarah Jacquette Ray at Humboldt State University here in California for their contributions to our thinking. Participants' anxiety stem from a desire to do more for the planet, lack of conversations with colleagues, and a lack of environmental knowledge or efforts within offices that don't seem to make much of an impact, or the impact is unknown. For example, recycling paper. If there are conversations, the solutions presented are unattainable. For example, buying an electric car. Next slide, please. To expand on the lack of conversations, some conversations about global warming and international education aren't held because it could be seen as negative. One participant stated that discussing the topic of going green felt like a threat to the field, especially considering international educators already have to justify why their field is important and the challenges faced during the COVID pandemic. This workplace experience contrasts with the activity in participants' personal lives, where they have tried to make environmentally conscious decisions around food and transportation. Some participants spoke about transitioning to vegetarianism and limiting the amount of plastic they use. Our interviewees also talked about how their education abroad experience taught them about different ways to be environmentally responsible, and they still use these practices today. Despite their efforts, there seemed to be a disjointed narrative. This disconnect between the lack of support regarding environmentally conscious decisions in their professional lives versus the consistent decisions made in their personal lives could be defined as career-related imposter syndrome. This feeling implied that they weren't able to fully express or enact their values, questions, and concerns to their work in international education. Now I will pass it to T to discuss the tension between actions and aspirations of practitioners.
Thank you so much, Maya, for providing an overview of climate anxiety and career-related imposter syndrome in our community of international education practitioners. I can definitely relate to some of the participants' frustrations and confusion at a personal level. And to supplement Maya's points, I'm going to present our second set of findings, which highlights significant gaps between current actions and aspirations of practitioners in responding to climate change, mainly at the organizational level. So one thing I'd like to highlight here is that despite the tension directed toward carbon emissions generated by plane travel, there were very few who said that international education might need to get rid of mobility altogether or ask students to pay for carbon offsets. Some participants even noted that this would penalize students and fail to address the main polluters, such as the big corporations. And instead, what we saw happening during the interviews was our participants had the will to make decisions focused on the environment. Notably, many of them expressed desire to expand international education as a tool to facilitate environmental justice and global citizenship. Examples of using international education to advance environmental awareness mostly included green education abroad programs which aim to raise awareness of sustainability in recruitment materials. For example, the marketing of eco-friendly habits in host countries, and those which incorporated environmental knowledge as a learning outcome. For example, the learning about climate refugees in Peru. And through these programs, students were able to adopt and educate others upon returning home on the culture of environmental responsibility in countries like Japan, France, and Switzerland. Some also became more conscious of how the Western consumption culture could affect the most vulnerable groups around the world, such as indigenous, minority, and low-income people, as well as how climate impact would always fall disproportionately on these communities. Next slide, please. And while these aspirations were legitimate, traditional priorities of international education programs, such as managing budget and time, growing enrollment and program variety, maximizing student learning, and responding to the demands from partners, prevented practitioners from engaging productively and consistently with sustainability goals. More specifically, some participants in our study were frustrated that supervisors and organizational leaders were not doing more to overcome the day-to-day business as usual practices, step out their comfort zones, and push for a more permanent change. They will also express concerns about sustainability practices, such as charging a carbon offset fee or having students volunteer to plant trees in the host country, calling them greenwashing. Our participants call them greenwashing. And they said that these practices had allowed organizations to create a false impression of commitment to sustainability, while ignoring their role in contributing to climate change, exacerbating inequity in access to international education for students, and perpetuating harmful aspects of volunteer tourism. And another intriguing point that a few interviewees brought up was that even though climate issues were emerging as an important topic in international education, other pressing global concerns, such as responding to the impact of COVID-19 and racial tensions around the world, have recently received greater attention, which further overshadows environmental needs. Interestingly, instead of seeing these issues as all part of an interconnected challenge for the field of international education, participants reported these as separate challenges that demanded additional time and resources during a very difficult time for the field of international education. I'm going to pass it back to Anne.
Thank you, T. And thank you, Maya, as well. So where we are now is we want to each leave you with one takeaway message, and we'll each take a turn, and I get to go first. So I'd like to highlight the point that professionals are asking for action. So from our research, we can say that the challenge is not whether practitioners are asking for leadership, information, and guidance on climate change and climate action. They're ready for action. It's time for us to look more deeply at the language, approach, and solutions that we recommend as a field. Without these, it leads to a feeling of eco paralysis or eco anxiety. And as one interviewee noted, it gives a feeling of an icky ethical feeling about the fields of international education. What we need are clear plans, platforms, programs, and methods within the fields of international education that truly reduce carbon while also promote intercultural learning and international education. And kudos to CANIE for this summit, which is pointed in that direction. And now I'll pass it to Maya.
Thank you. So in addition to change, practitioners must recognize that climate action is social justice work. Climate change negatively impacts everyone, but severely impacts people of color and those who are most vulnerable worldwide. It's unfair to keep imposing our unsustainable consumer practices in other countries. We must create sustainable programs that won't become a burden to the local host countries and communities or those that have a negative impact on their environment. As one step forward, we must teach students to calculate and mitigate their carbon footprint, especially in new environments as much as possible. This can be done in program materials, during the pre-departure process, during the program, and once students return home. It is important now more than ever. And I'll pass it to T.
And last but not least, there is, of course, an urgent need for international education as a field to orient policies and practices more toward environmental interests. From our conversations with practitioners, sustainability should be a mandatory aspect of mobility program design and of the intercultural curriculum. We should also put hope in returnees of green education abroad programs, since these students could pay it forward by sharing their transformative environmental learning experiences and generating impact at home, be it through campus engagement activities or leadership roles in their communities. And let's never forget, the responsibility doesn't lie on us alone. Collaborations across all disciplines and industries are paramount to combating climate change, and international education practitioners play a key role in catalyzing such collaborations, given our significant contribution to and frequent interaction with tourism, business, diplomacy, informational technology, social good, and many other sectors. And no matter which stage we are in our careers or where we're coming from, we all share a mutual responsibility in building a more altruistic, just, and sustainable world. And this is why we need to take a pro-climate stance in our work, support one another, and most importantly, guide generations of internationally mobile students to be change agents in the era of global warming. And this brings us to the end of our presentations. Our contact information is on the screen. Feel free to get in touch in the future if you have any questions or would like to have a more in-depth conversation with all of us. Thank you so much for listening and have a great time at the summit.
Great. So as you can see, we are joined by Dr. Ann Campbell and Maya Stewart. How are you ladies doing? How are you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. It's nice to see you all.
Same, doing pretty well. Happy to be here.
I am very happy that you are here. And I'm really excited to get into this discussion. If you haven't, people who are joining us, if you haven't already, you might, Maya and Anne and T joined us on a podcast. It was the first episode of season 2. So you'll hear me referring to the podcast. If you haven't checked it out, 10/10 recommend. It was a great way to kick off season 2 because this work is really about you and about practitioners. And so I'm keen to dig in with more questions since we last spoke. And if you have questions, and I see some are coming up in the chat, and that's really great. So Anne, you mentioned in the presentation that people, were proactively asking you about this, whether it was your colleagues and students. And I love that your research was about getting into people's feelings. And I think that everyone is here today because they have a feeling that they want to take action. So how do you hope that this research, this new research, is used in the sector and by practitioners?
Yeah, thanks, CJ. And I also send greetings on behalf of Tina Nguyen. She's sorry, she can't be here today. So it's a really good question of how this research might actually be used. And I think that's, at least for me, that's an essential part of all research, that it actually has some impact on change and social change. And for us, we're really, first and foremost, wanted to explore this notion of an elephant in the room, so to speak, and if it was something that we needed to explore more and understand. But as you noted, it did come from a lot of tough questions that were asked of me as a faculty member and as a former administrator of international education, of how I was reacting and how I was sleeping at night and how I was going about dealing with all of this. And at the time, it was quite surprising to me that there was very little around the emotion of responding to climate. Although many of us live in parts of the world where it's happening daily, that we see climate change outside of our windows. But for me, it was not, it took a long time to understand kind of the conversation around climate anxiety and eco-paralysis. And it's increased over time quite a bit. So that's actually quite impressive. When we started this work a little over a year ago, there was almost nothing, and now it's quite common. But I do think that it has taken a while to think about what we're talking about, what students are talking about, how to go about reconciling being so committed to international education, and at the same time realizing that it is also contributing to carbon outlay and the lifestyles. So it was very much student motivated and kind of self-reflected.
Great, thank you for that. And Maya, I did want to ask you a question. One of the findings that T mentioned in her presentation was about the frustrations that practitioners are feeling and that your interviewees were feeling, or challenges that they're facing in needing to know how to deal with climate action in addition to sort of the racial justice issues. And you mentioned in your closing that climate action work is social justice work. And I'm hoping that you can expand on what that means for our practitioners here today, and what actions they can take as a result of that real truth, but in that perspective.
Yeah, so like I said in the presentation, and like T had spoken about as well, that the hardest hit populations are those who are underrepresented, underserved, and typically people of color. So I'll speak from more of a study abroad, education abroad focus, since that's what I'm more comfortable speaking about. But I think from the practitioner standpoint, I think it's really important to look at the whole program. What kind of activities are students going to be doing that relies on transportation, push back on something that you think might not be a very environmentally friendly or environmentally conscious way to do this activity, for example. I think when talking to students, ask students about I guess this is more of a reflective or emotional side, but a benefit cost analysis. What's your impact going to be when you go there versus what you're actually going to get from the program? Because it might not require a student to actually travel to have those experiences. Not saying that travel isn't important, but at the same time, we're now in a climate crisis, so we have to think about how we're going to do things differently.
Yeah, and that's the challenge, is how to do things differently. And in the context of the climate justice piece, if you haven't, I see some faces from yesterday's climate justice session, which is great. And if you didn't get a chance, it will be posted to YouTube in the next couple of days. But that was I think what Maya, you're speaking to, hits on so many of those points that were sort of elaborated on. So thank you. So Anne, I went back and listened to her podcast in preparation for this event, and you shared some qualitative feedback, both in this presentation and when you all were guests on the pod, that was just so relatable. I felt like, I remember when we were talking, I remember feeling like these participants in your study were saying things out loud that were just like quietly discussed in the sector, or like, and only among your like most close trusted colleagues. Like, I don't think they, which is going green and going global in this case, I don't think they necessarily contradict each other, but I can't think of a way where you can accomplish those things at the same time. Or like you mentioned in the presentation, the icky feeling. And so I'm wondering what surprised you the most about what you heard people share with you during these interviews.
Yeah, thanks, CJ. I think for me, people were very honest about the emotional side of it, as your first question alluded to, and how they really felt stuck and immobile. They weren't sure what to do. And there was kind of a crummy realization of holding both a true dedication to international education and really feeling that they had benefited so much from it, as Maya, T, and I have, and also really wanting to do more for the planet. And as we talked about in the presentation, the ways that our interviewees manage their lives in their personal space is amazing. I mean, the lists of things that they do to reduce plastic, to take public transportation, it's remarkable. And then this kind of imposter syndrome that Maya mentioned in the workplace, of like feeling like they can't really have those conversations, or they don't really see the same commitment from their colleagues, or it's just something else to talk about when there's so many other things going on that are equally as important. And so I think what really surprised me was how like kind of raw and honest a lot of these conversations had, and also in real time people talked about like feeling anxious like in the conversation. So that was really quite surprising.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I can imagine. And you mentioned just now in your answer, like there's so many things going on, and there's people are being pulled in different directions, and there's different tensions. So I did want to ask, in terms of the tension between what in your research you say is like the ethical priorities and the financial priorities, and how like business as usual is actually quite difficult to fight against. And I think that everybody here, feels that and experiences that. And I'm wondering what your interviewees did share in terms of like what they felt that they needed to start pushing back. Because you guys have shared historically sort of a few points on that. I'm wondering if you can share that with some people in terms of like what the ideas that some of them shared and sort of what you extrapolated from that.
Go ahead, Maya.
I could talk about one idea that came up a good bit, was a collaboration, at least at Middlebury, with International Environmental Policy, the department at Middlebury Institute, but extending that outside of the Institute. I think it would be pretty important to talk to the people who are making these policies, or at least people who are well versed in the environment, in those issues, because we're not speaking the same language. And I think it's important that we speak the same language at this point.
Great. Anne, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just to add on, I think it also speaks to these silos, right? We're also busy and we talk the same language with the people we know within international education, but also thinking about how to cross fields and conversations. One of the things that blew my mind from the research was, a call that we in international education should be putting pressure on the airlines as like an activist, and like thinking of ourselves as long haul flyers and travelers. And of course, I never think of international education as a subset of travelers. I think of it as a subset of education. So just kind of new ways of thinking and new alliances.
Hey, I love that. And anyone, I love figuring out like completely different ways of looking at it. And so I'm very grateful that you were able to like point one specific example of that. Short question with what is a very massive scope of answer, I think, is in terms of like addressing specifically, you know, the climate anxiety in practitioners. We talked about it, but is there anything in terms of like good resources that you might be able to share with us?
Yeah, I can start, and then Maya, feel free to add. So there's actually quite a few things that have come out this past week. There's a piece in NPR and Washington Post about managing climate anxiety. So that's been helpful to me. Two things that I really like. One is, and I'll put them in the chat here. Maybe I'll introduce them and then put them in the chat so I can stay focused. One is a piece around the existential toolkit and looking at what we can do within the space of looking at this kind of existential threat and moving forward as educators. And then a second is a book called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety by Sarah Jaquette Ray, who's at Humboldt State here in California. And really looking at like how to live and manage in this world that we now inhabit, where we do have these climate threats and this idea of living with climate change as opposed to pretending it's something outside of our daily reality, both as students and educators.
Thank you. And Maya, did you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, I don't have many resources, but I'm learning about resources through my environmental economics class I'm currently taking. And I think something that I have taken away from that class so far is learning about what's happening locally in your community regarding the environment. If there's educational efforts, and I guess you could build partnerships from there, especially with international education. That's something that's been very key, a big takeaway from that class so far.
Great, thank you. I'm still taking classes, love that. So I just wanted to go to a question that came in the chat. So if anyone else has questions, by all means, please do post them. But Amy asked, curious to know what some of the more difficult questions or topics were that your interviewees to sort of answer or address.
I'll start, and then Maya, feel free to jump in. Thanks for the question, Amy. I think one of the things that was really perplexing at that time was how practitioners should be advising students. So a lot of the questions were coming from students who were interested in international education and wanted to know, is it better to delay the opportunity or to go now? Was it better to study closer to home or further away? Should they come home for the holidays? Should the parents visit? These kinds of questions of how do you actually make responsible choices as part of programming. And in our interviews, these were like legitimate questions that people who were advising students didn't know the answer to, and also we're trying to build programs around some of these principles and weren't sure what was recommended. So I think kind of the nuts and bolts was definitely one aspect of it.
I think that goes into sort of Leanna's question as well, which is in terms of like tips for research for mobility program like Erasmus Plus to help with projects become more green. And then I love the like self-edit of perhaps this is better to be discussed during the last part of the session, which might be either getting started, but also really important to discuss with other practitioners for what that looks like. But if you had any comments sort of on that, I can sort of let that sit with you for a second because I did have another question myself. So I will come back to that one, but that one's coming for you if you have some answers. So the path forward. What might a few options be? either Maya or Anne, yeah.
I think one of the ways forward is to work towards a few guiding principles that we as a field can agree to. They may not be perfect, but there is still, I can see lots of people smiling. I'm guessing this is not an original idea, but there is still quite a bit of a debate, at least from what I can tell, around do we decrease travel? Do we encourage a certain type of it? What do we prioritize? Is on-campus internationalization better than mobility? And it still feels very much like a debate as opposed to something that we can all get behind and a way forward. So I think we need a sophistication in how we talk about these things. As Maya noted, we need to have some more language so we can talk to the policy side, we can talk to the scientists and understand how to kind of bridge the silos, so to speak. But also, I think a plan where we can all get behind it would be a step in the right direction.
You are very right that we are all smiling. I don't know if Elsa, you wanted to pop in, but this is definitely something that has been addressed, and you and T and Maya had done a call to action video specifically around the Leaders Forum in being able to really call our leadership of the sector to sort of take that position and move forward. And Elsa, it kind of, I think it's actually pretty hilarious. I think you want to just allude to how that is connected to what we're talking about.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I was just actually going in and amending my presentation slides so that I can show you the draft principles that we just discussed yesterday with a whole group of climate or of international education leaders at our 2 leaders forums. So I'll come back to that in a moment, but basically, yes, that I think there is soon about to be a set of principles that people will sign up to. I'll go back to saving it now.
Yeah, so you were correctly spotting those smiles, because we're like, yes, that is very validating to hear, because I think that the work that you and the team have done is incredibly meaningful, and a lot of these leaders have a responsibility to their associations or university members, or universities are their members, and practitioners are the employees of their members, and so anxiety and climate anxiety among practitioners is something of great concern at the sort of highest levels of the sector, because it's something that people are feeling, and the practitioners are feeling, and as the associations serve members, this is part of it. So a quick last note, but I'm wondering how you hope that share how you hope to see the sector and practitioners and people here respond to your research at the highest levels, but also just people starting out in their career and international as well. So how you hope to see the research used.
Maya, do you want to go first?
Yeah, that's a big question. I'm trying to think. I mean, one of the big hopes is that I hope it doesn't get lost. I think this is very important. And of course, we're on a call with people who care about these issues. So I think that's very important. But something that has been on my mind lately is, being a graduate student about a year away from graduation, if I didn't work with Ann and T, there's a chance that we would have never talked about these issues. They would have never come up. So thinking about my cohort, they're going to be entering this market without having talked about these things. So I really hope it doesn't get lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, and my hope is maybe two-pronged. One is that I hope we acknowledge that people are having some pretty strong emotions about this, and that it's not just Gen Z, but that it's us as well, and that needs to be acknowledged and managed. It's a lot of additional emotional effort. And then also, of course, the connection to the larger issues around social justice and climate justice, that these are not separate issues, but they're all interconnected. And international education has the power to really galvanize support and understand the connections as it has before and will continue, and that it's in a unique place to really move things forward. So yeah, so we're grateful for that.
Well, we're grateful for you sharing this research and being such wonderful partners to CANIE and supporting our work and supporting the work of all the people who come to CANIE events and just are the network, if you will. And like you, Maya, I think this is really important. And what I hope is that this session continues to move that discussion forward as a real acknowledgement, and that how people are feeling about this is an important part of our work and having to process this as individuals, as teams within a department, as a department within a university, and at the bigger sector. So thank you so much for being here. I invite you to sort of engage in the chat, and if there's perhaps some thoughts for Liana, or stick around as long as you can. But yes, thank you so much. And I saw all the sort of reactions here. So I think everyone else really appreciates it as well. Great. So up next, I love this, on time, on schedule. This is wonderful. And up next, the one, the only, Ailsa Lamont, the co-founder and president of the CANIE board, the reason that all of us are here today with this ambitious program as part of Climate Action Week, and also the person who is always willing to give and meet people where they are. And so we heard loud and clear that there was a need for getting started and some like almost 101 of the climate action. And so Ailsa, before we move on to our discussion and your presentation, welcome. How are you feeling about the week so far?
Thanks, CJ. I'm energized, tired because of Zoom lag, but energized because of, as I think I said to somebody yesterday at one of the Leaders Forum sessions, I kind of think about this stuff pretty much all the time. It's just wonderful to be spending time with lots of people who are also focused on the same issues. And it's just so important. And I think, I love all the work that you do, Anne and Maya and Tate, and climate anxiety is real. And I think one of the best things we can do to address it is to take action. And it's the only way, certainly, that I've found to kind of damp down any anxiety I have, is know that you're doing what you can to try and fix the problem and to raise awareness and bring others on board. So I'm feeling pretty energized. So thanks, everyone. And what I'm going to do, it's a good sized group. Do pop your questions in the chat, and we will have a chance at the end to answer a lot of questions as well. Hopefully my very late little PowerPoint amendment there will work. Here we go. Perfect, that worked. And I'll see if I can take myself over here so I'm not in the way. Cool. So as part of, I won't stay on this for too long, but just because it came up in that last section, and I think it is important because we're not operating in a vacuum. We're all trying to make these changes in the broader context of international education. So what people do in other organizations and peak bodies and national associations, that all impacts what we are able to do within individual institutions and organizations. It kind of creates the permission and the environment that we get to make change in. So part of what CANIE has done this week, as well as these open sessions, is that for the first time, we actually brought together senior leaders in international education around the world, and we tried to we just had, it was an experiment. It worked fantastically. There's so much energy and so much desire amongst people within the field to really make change and to collaborate. And one of the things that people said we needed was a kind of core set of principles that could inform how we move on. So these are definitely going to be wordsmithed, and we'd love to get your input into them. But essentially, we'll be asking people across the sector to sign up to what we're going to call the CANIE COP26 Glasgow Protocol, which will have a set of guiding principles at the start, and then some really specific actions that people will sign on to. So thank you. That was a great chance for us to bring that in. So now I know that everyone is from different countries, different types of organization and different roles, but I think there are some common basics that we can all look at and can be useful to all of us. So what I want to do today is just kind of look at, hopefully strengthen your understanding of how climate action and international education intersect, and give you some practical tools and takeaways that you should be able to put into practice no matter what role you're in. So some climate action basics. First of all, we're going to look at what we know about how climate change and international ed intersect. Very importantly, we'll look at student attitudes and how they might drive change, but also how we might be able to amplify them in order to build that case within our own organizations. Offer a possible framework for action, some ideas and resources and tips. Okay, so why is this so important? You're all here, so you all understand, but essentially the way that we operate is in the world, in society, is still just pumping millions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere every day. And our temperatures are warming. Basically now we're at around 1.2 degrees Celsius globally on average, above where we were round about the middle of the 19th century, so in the start of the Industrial Revolution. In some parts of the world, it's obviously much higher. In Australia, the land temperatures are actually already about 1.4 degrees higher. And of course, in Australia, we've already seen the devastating impacts of the bushfires. And as of course, many of you have seen impacts wherever you are as well. You know, nowhere is immune. And if you haven't actually experienced it yourself yet, unfortunately, you probably will soon. So what can we do? Well, there are so many great actions people are talking about. People are talking about building climate literacy among students, and obviously universities and other higher education institutions invest in research. But really, we don't have much time. The latest IPCC reports, the UN's climate reports, sounded a code red for humanity. They basically said this next few years is critical. We have until the end of this decade at most, and every day we delay is another potential fraction of a degree that we heat the planet and disrupt our whole climate system, with all the devastating potential impacts that that has for our societies, biodiversity, public health, democracy even. You know, this is really existential stuff, and we cannot leave. Unfortunately, it would be wonderful if we could invest all of our time and resources into educating the next generation so that they didn't make the mistakes that we and our predecessors had, but we don't have that luxury. We basically have to pull out every single stop, that every lever that we have at our disposal now to try and not use up what little remains of our carbon budget. So how does international education fit in? Well, obviously we know International student travel plays a part, staff and faculty, international travel, and then there are all the other associated activities. So brochure production and shipping, our events and catering, our supply chain. When we look at what international educators can do, we tend not to look so much at the institutional emissions. So most universities, for example, would have their own sustainability office, sustainability targets and plans. I'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute, but generally they don't include international office activities or student mobility within those targets. Even the most active, the most ambitious universities with great net zero strategies, usually they all kind of park international student mobility and business travel off to one side because it's kind of been seen as too hard. So what we're talking about, what we focus on with CANIE is, where can international educators make a difference? What are all the bits that fall through the cracks in most institutions or organizations' approach to tackling the problem? So a huge part of this is travel, and in particular, it's flying. Now, although aviation emissions, depending on what calculation you use, they might only take up around a couple of % of the overall emissions in the world. But for us in our field, that is still the area where we make by far the greatest contribution to generating emissions. Now, Professor Robin Shields from the University of Bristol, who moderated one of our sessions last night and is a friend of CANIE, he did some really groundbreaking research on this a couple of years ago, where he actually calculated the emissions associated with degree-seeking students, internationally mobile students. And he calculated that they generated around 14 to 39 megatons of CO2 equivalent emissions each year, just based on their travel to and from their destinations. Now, to put that in context, that's roughly the size, the emissions of a medium-sized country. So you like Croatia, for example. So when you think about the climate talks that are taking place in Glasgow at the moment, the COP26, and how there are roughly 200 countries in the world, and we're asking every country to do their part. Well, we can think of international education as being similar to that. We are a country, in terms of the scale of our emissions, we should also be doing our part. And in fact, I think it was one of the, it might have been T from Middlebury who said previously, what is international education for if it isn't about tackling these global issues? So we're part of the problem in that we generate these emissions. We recognize that there's a huge benefit that comes to getting a global education or global study experience. So we don't want to stop people from accessing those benefits, but how can we do it more intentionally, and where can we cut down the emissions that are completely unnecessary or that can be reduced? So this is the point I made earlier about how very often institutions don't count international student mobility or business travel. Carbon accounting basically classifies emissions into 3 different categories. So most universities, for example, their net zero plans might cover scope 1 and scope 2, and they'll be doing all sorts of great work to make the campus infrastructure more sustainable. But it's this scope 3 part, which is where we have a chance to make a difference. So I would say to you, if you are in an organization that has a climate plan, has climate targets, go back to them and ask them, have you included scope 3 in this? Are you actually counting this? Can we work together? What is there that we could do perhaps to strengthen your voice and help you advocate for greater power and resources to make change within your organization? Okay, so now we're going to have a quick poll just to check out of interest to see how many of you actually know about the emissions associated with your work. CJ and Adrian, I can't actually launch the poll at the moment. It's not allowing me to, so we might be able to, we might not.
I think actually Luke is the one who has the poll power right now, having been the last person to sign in through the CANIE account. So Luke has the power of the poll.
Okay, Luke,
to launch the poll.
If you have the power, launch away. I will be very interested to see. I think there's some real kind of regional variation in who does know what their emissions are and who doesn't. And I suppose, having worked in universities previously myself for many years, I understand that generally, if something doesn't get tracked and doesn't have a target and a KPI against it, it's very often not something that gets taken particularly seriously either. Look, I'm not seeing a poll, but that could be because I've got my screen share on. Is anyone else seeing a poll? Yes, okay, that's great. Fantastic. If somebody from CANIE could be my eyes on this, please, that would be great.
How are we doing for responses there, Luke?
We have two holdouts or two who have not participated yet.
I think 2 holdouts is not bad. Let's assume they're doing their yoga exercises in the background and they can't reach the screen. So maybe we could share the results.
So 75% of the respondents said they do not know the emissions associated with any aspect of my work, aspect of my area of work. There's a split 6%, 6%, 6% between the very top. I know the volume of emissions associated with every aspect of my work. I have partial knowledge, and I have partial knowledge. I know the emissions associated with student travel, and I know the emissions associated with operations. And then at 19% partial knowledge, I know the emissions associated with staff travel.
That doesn't actually surprise me, the 75%. In fact, that's pretty good compared to other instances where I've asked the same question. Okay, so we're only having one poll, so that's good. We should hopefully find things a little bit easier from now on. So some people ask why the focus on flying, and really it is the most carbon intensive activity associated with international education. I've just in the last few days, I've heard questions from people saying, well, but I know that there are emissions associated with online conferencing, with events like this, for example, and that's true, there are, but they are just many thousands of times less harmful in terms of emissions generating. So really, when we look at what we need to do, one of the key things is to cut down on the flying. But I suppose this is where people sometimes get a little bit nervous, but they shouldn't, because we're not trying to stop students from getting an international experience. We're talking about the different ways that you might be able to lower the emissions associated with the mobility itself and with supporting the mobility. So if it comes to a choice between, for example, reducing flights for students or flights for the staff behind the scenes, you cut the staff flights. You cut flights for reduced travel for people like me who have had the pleasure and privilege of traveling all over the world for many decades. You might reduce or limit the amounts of opportunities for the senior researchers to travel compared to the early career researchers. And a really interesting idea that was raised last night at one of the Leaders Forum sessions was about doing that analysis of the impact. So you perhaps invest your kind of carbon budget, your your little, the amount of carbon emissions that you allow yourself, you invest that in the students for whom it will make the most difference. So that is still speaking to climate justice and issues of equity and access. If you're lucky enough to be in a part of the world with a strong train network or other forms of public transport, obviously what you can do is try and incentivize lower carbon means of travel. So train over plane. There are so many programs in Europe that are doing that. I saw a reference in the chat earlier to Erasmus. They have Green Erasmus. There are a number of universities, particularly in Europe, that are really focused on this, and that actually penalize flights and incentivize lower other forms of travel to their study destinations. One thing that some institutions are doing is actually banning their students from traveling to places that they have to fly to. Now, that's not necessarily something that we'd probably all endorse, but it's certainly one way of bringing down your emissions. So let's move on now to student attitudes. We know that this is an issue around the world, that young people, not just young people, but especially young people who will obviously bear the brunt of the worst impacts of global heating in the decades to come, are really agitating for change. Now, that is translating into choices around travel and around study from some countries, not necessarily yet from all, but as we start to build a bigger picture around this through inclusion of climate and sustainability questions in international student surveys and questionnaires and research, as the rankings such as the Times Higher Education Impact Ranking and others start to kick in and students recognize that they actually have a way of rating institutions according to how seriously they take the climate crisis, I think that will change. One thing I would like to point to is this recent research that came out from Times Higher Education. It's called the Student Pulse, and they looked specifically at what climate action and sustainability means to prospective international students when they're making their choices. And this survey was actually prospective degree-seeking students, primarily from India and other parts of Asia, going to the major English language speaking destinations. And I've heard people interpret this slide in different ways. Somebody, in fact, just yesterday said, oh, well, look, students don't really care that much. Look here, the university's commitment to sustainability is only the second bottom most important factor here for this cohort when they were deciding where to study. But looked at another way, it's actually quite incredible that that hasn't been put front and center of how universities present themselves. And it's only really recently come into our kind of thinking in terms of international education and especially perhaps the international recruitment. And yet it's 9%, which is 9% of students in the survey ranked sustainability as the most important, the deciding factor of where to study, which is the same as graduate employability prospects. Now think about how much effort institutions put into bolstering and promoting the graduate employability prospects. And it's also more important to this cohort, at least, than the location of the university. So these are not unimportant factors. And I think it will be really clear that I think this is likely to change. We will certainly watch with interest. So some specific, before we go to specific ideas, I want to just share a couple of ways of kind of thinking about this that I think are helpful. So tackling climate action can be about the positive and the negative. So lowering emissions, but also looking at ways to make a tangible positive climate impact. And that could be through building climate literacy, for example, or through thinking about other ways that you can actually build really positive, whether that's through bringing in new scholarships or new programs around climate issues. So here's a kind of hierarchy of action I would suggest people take. First of all, eliminate any unnecessary emissions, start tracking and making plans to reduce the rest. If we have time, we can talk about insetting and offsetting, but I'll just skip over that for now because that's a whole other conversation. Certainly use your power within your organization and your actual programming to educate and influence, and think about where you spend your money and who you spend your money with. I realize that we don't have a great deal of time left, and I want to really make sure that we have some important, the chance to talk to the panel. So I'll just quickly flick through some of these examples. This is a really useful tool I've found on sustainable travel tips, one of the best I've found. And you can also find guides online that are specific to more sustainable travel within learning abroad. And there's the nice version of that slide. So here we go, here's the summary. First of all, put it in your strategy. If it's not in your strategy, it's going to get passed over. Make sure that it is in your institutional strategy and your departmental strategy. Look at what you can measure, find out what is being measured, start tracking, start making plans to reduce. Have the conversation with your colleagues. You might find that there are others who will come and join you and add their weight to yours. Next, just ignore the numbering system here. I'm not quite sure what happened there. Build a consensus around the need to act. And I'm sure that Ainsley might be able to bring in some points on that when we're on the panel. And the last point is kind of the opposite of Fight Club. So it's like you must talk about climate action and you must get started. That's basically it. There is no better way to do it than to get started and see where you go. So that's all I want to leave you with here, and then hopefully we can pick those quick points up in the panel.
Yeah, Ailsa, thank you. Just a few key takeaways there. Easy peasy getting started, building consensus, but I think your last point of getting started is really just what everyone is here for. And I think that the two women who are going to join us on the panel today to talk about this, you may have met them already or seen them in various CANIE events so far, but both are incredibly accomplished and very glad to have them on this panel. Adrian Fusick, hello, who is the Director of International Programs and Partnerships at San Diego State University and a CANIE Global Board member. And Ainsley Moore, the Deputy Director of International at the University of Auckland, and also the CANIE Oceania Chapter Vice President? Secretary?
I stuffed it up and went for president.
Ooh, president, very exciting. Awesome. Okay, well, an accomplished group. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I'm just going to get right into it because I think both of your experience is really relevant to this conversation. Ainsley, the University of Auckland, two-time Times Higher Ed Impact Ranking winner, if you will, overall, and the first 2 years. And I'm wondering, and sort of the University of Auckland being super present in the climate discussions, climate actions conversations, a supporter, an early supporter of CANIE, and recent guest on the pod. But can you talk a little bit about what the catalyst or the turning point was for the international team in sort of taking action?
Thanks, AJ, and thanks for having me here. One of the catalysts for us was the Times Higher Education ranking. So understanding how each part of a university contributes to those 17 goals. It's not just one person, not just one thing, not just leadership, but actually everybody across the university, whether they're researchers, teachers, or professional staff, can make some kind of contribution to how, as an institution, we contribute to meeting those SDGs. And then a realization that the international office also has an obligation to make a contribution. And thinking about how we did that, how we amplify the efforts of other parts of the university, how working with others would help us to be better and do better and grow more. Sort of evolved over about a year. Then we reached out and found ourselves some professional help. Thank you, Elsa, helping us to understand the actual impact, the actual size of the carbon footprint of the office, and some suggestions for what we could do early to improve and what we could do long-term to improve.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And now to Adrienne. Ilse mentioned in her presentation, and I know that I think a lot of people here are a different version, sort of different points in their journey, but in any journey, you kind of have to find allies in moving this forward. Ilse talked about sort of communicating with colleagues and inviting people to the table. Can you talk a little bit about challenges of finding allies within an institution?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we hear a lot about silos, and I think this is a really good example of that. It's really hard to know what your colleagues are thinking unless you're talking about it, right? And so at my institution, I've had some colleagues for over a decade. We're always talking about climate and what we do in our individual lives to try to reduce our footprint. But in terms of a professional, like that professional connection and making climate action part of your work, it's really hard. It's really difficult to kind of know what folks are thinking. And to emphasize this, so I one day was just sitting at my desk and I get the Secuse emails, and there was a link to CANIE. I was like, oh, what is this? And so I clicked on the CANIE website, and lo and behold, my colleague, Eddie West, who's like in the next building from me, is one of the co-founders. And so I swear I want to just like close my computer and run over there and just say, oh my goodness, like, how did you make this happen? Like, and so he looped me into CANIE. And so, I mean, in terms of challenges, I just, they're real, I think that just kind of really emphasizes how difficult it is to really kind of understand what your colleagues are thinking. But I want to encourage folks to sort of think beyond like, who your allies could be. So if you're, and I wish that I had done this, but if you're passionate about climate action and sustainability, as Elsa said, most institutions have a sustainability committee or sustainability office. Those people can be your allies. Go ahead and introduce yourselves to them, talk to them, and try to get on any committees that exist and build those coalitions to kind of have that partnership between international and the sustainability areas on campus.
I really like how you alluded to that sort of disconnect between like your personal life and your sort of professional life. That goes back to what Anne and T were talking about, and how there's this all of this like compounds the disconnect that we're feeling and confounds things in our head to make them seem even more challenging. So what was it, just to dig in on that point a little bit, as what was the turning point for you in terms of gaining momentum?
We kind of talk about this, the climate anxiety in terms of like cognitive dissonance. Like I want to live my life a certain way, but my work feels contrary to that. But I love international. So what do I do? It's like all this stuff that Ann, T, and Maya are talking about and researching. But what I finally did was just inserted myself. I didn't ask for permission. I inserted myself on committees on campus. So the University Senate Committee on Sustainability they had never had anybody from the international area represented on that committee. And so I just started showing up. And I'm not a voting member, but I'm involved in every conversation. I can inform people's decisions by being part of those conversations. And actually, Eddie West, my colleague I was referring to earlier, he was very instrumental in, he is on that committee as well. We both kind of like, weaseled our way in there. But he was instrumental in passing a resolution on climate conscious travel through that Senate committee. And yeah, I think that was kind of a turning point. I also was able to finagle my way onto the strategic planning implementation teams for 3 sustainability related action teams, essentially. And I led the kind of getting our global strategy up and running. And so I was able to connect the global strategy, like make sustainability an integral part to that global strategy, because I was on these other committees and kind of making sure, that strategic alignment that we talk about in the university strategy and our global strategy, and making sure those things interconnect and align. So I didn't ask, I just did it.
I love that. That it has strong echoes of how I became involved in CANIE. It's just like, hey, Elsa. So it sounds very much, yeah. You just like insert yourself into these conversations, and now you're part of the narrative and advancing these like really important things. And that can be an uncomfortable, new experience for people, but what sounds like wholly rewarding. And I know it has been for me, so that's great. So we're talking about this pretty dramatic change, conscious travel, moving things through a university senate. That's no small feat. So in terms of dramatic change, and this one's for Ainsley, what are your hopes for big dramatic change?
Thanks, AJ. Before I jump in, I just wanted to absolutely emphasize Adrian's point. Don't ask permission. There is space for us in these conversations. It's much easier to get going and get started and have people observe what you're doing and be invited into places than to wait for someone to realize that the international office might have an interest in this work. What I'm hoping for in terms of dramatic change, I think that we need to look at the success that our students have had. I'm thinking back to the work of about a decade ago when our students started advocating for divestment of university funds into fossil fuels and similar, and just the persistence with which they advocated to get university councils to make a difference. And when that happened, a particular instance in Australia, the Australian National University divested, and the national media were up in arms. There were furious op-eds. Government ministers started advocating for legislative changes to prevent universities from doing things like this. It was a real pushback to the establishment, especially in a country that's so invested in fossil fuels. But what that taught me is that we can be ambitious and that our students can lead the way. So let's pay a bit of attention to what our students are asking for. And this week they've been asking for a lot, and thinking about how we can hear what they're saying and lend our weight, our leadership to what they're after. One of the things that I heard in a PI session last week was students calling for sustainability education and activism to be taught to them, not in a discipline-specific way, but across every aspect of their degree. And that's going to take not just the international office, not just our teaching staff, but the whole of the university to stop and have a think about how we apply a sustainability lens to almost everything we do. So my ambition, my hope is the dramatic change led by our students.
Beautiful. And just to sort of start making our way and sort of into the networking session, which we'll get to in a second, I want to sort of, those are beautiful ways to end, but I want to give you both an opportunity to sort of share what the top 2 or 3 things that people can start doing today in your experience to move their international office forward over and above just like not asking for permission, which I'm super into.
I can take that one first. So I thought about this a little bit, and I think what I recommend as your number one action is to write this into your performance goals. If you have the ability or allowed that kind of flexibility to define your own performance goals, even if it's just a small portion of it, make it part of what you do and what you're evaluated against. And if you're responsible for, determining performance goals for others, for your staff, make it part of what they do. And then it kind of comes out from the periphery into the core of, what you say you value, and you're really kind of showing that you do, you're demonstrating that. And then you can build those metrics and kind of go from there. That would be my number one thing. I have several others, but I would say, okay, just two more. So build your coalition and expand the idea of who you think of as an ally. So don't be afraid to just get out there, email blast people. If you think a committee needs to exist for the purpose of attacking this on your campus or your institution, then create a committee and send an email blast out to everybody. Do it. We can't really sit around and wait and talk. Like Greta says, blah, blah, blah. We do so much of that. Like, let's make things happen. And very lastly, as Joan Baez says, action is the antidote to despair. Or she said that in one of her songs, I think. So if we're talking about climate anxiety, climate despair, take action, do something about it. And I think it will help you feel better if you're experiencing the climate despair and anxiety. And just really, really do what you need to do to take care of yourself to be able to continue doing this important work, because we need you. We need all of you.
Where we need you is in CANIE. Join CANIE. Make that your first thing. Identify the CANIE organization, the chapter that you want to be part of. And if you happen to be in Canada or North America, consider joining the leadership team of the about to be established CANIE chapter. Lean into this work because it is very important, and it is something that we can do together. And like a very specific thing that you can do in your offices is we're a very data-driven organization. You can't, and most universities are, if it's not measured, it doesn't matter. Find a way to measure what you do so that you can report on progress and it becomes part of what you do.
Wow. Well, those are some wise words, some inspiring words, and I think really great words to get us into the mindset to connect with the rest of our colleagues in our networking session. Adrian, if I could trouble you for just the last of it so we can round it off. Enough of my blah, blah, blahing. This was really fantastic, and we really want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to take action. And like Ainsley and Adrian said, there are opportunities now to start taking action. So one of the things that is really important to us, and it shaped this conversation today and this space, is we have a survey over for each that includes all sessions. So if we could trouble you, you'll see the link in the chat in a couple of minutes. We're also going to circulate it afterwards if you don't have a chance to fill it out right now. But we'd love to get your feedback on this session, which is the CANIE Climate Action Summit session number 1. And we want to hear how else we can help you. But even more importantly, that survey includes a question near the end about how you want to get involved. Would you like to be involved in a regional chapter? Would you like to be involved in a subject matter specific working group? And those can be anything from our climate justice working groups to our marketing working groups to our podcast working groups, and facilitating events, because that's a really important part of what we're doing, more events like this. So your feedback from previous sessions helped us shape today's session. So if you liked it, it's thank you in big part to you and your feedback over the last sort of year and a half. And we look forward to continuing to improve. And please do share your thoughts with us. But I want to move us to the sort of breakout sessions now so that we can have some time to chat. And so the breakout rooms, we're just going to sort of assign them randomly, but we will give you the permission to sort of move around. And so we're just going to break into 2 groups so that people can sort of have that discussion, and we will go from there.